নমস্কার। জার্মানির শীতের দুপুর থেকে বলছি। আমি শৈবাল গিরি। জার্মানিতে যখন দুপুর 3টে, কলকাতায় এখন সন্ধে 7:30, দুবাইতে সন্ধে 6টা, লন্ডনে দুপুর 2টো, আর আটলান্টিক পেরিয়ে নিউ ইয়র্ক হয়তো আড়মোড়া ভাঙছে এই শীতের সকালে। সেই রোববার দুপুরে আপনাদের সবাইকে আন্তরিকভাবে আমরা স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আজকের এই অনুষ্ঠানে। এই অনুষ্ঠানে সম্প্রীতি মিউনিকের উদ্যোগে এই অনুষ্ঠান। আজকে আমরা নেতাজির 125তম জন্ম শতবার্ষিকী পালনের উদ্দেশ্যে, আগামী বছর যেটা পালন হবে, সেই উদ্যোগের উদ্দেশ্যে আমরা একটা শুরু করছি। সারা বছর ধরে এই অনুষ্ঠান চলবে এবং আজকে বলা যেতে পারে এই অনুষ্ঠানের শুভারম্ভ। এই শুভারম্ভের শুরুতে কতগুলি বিষয় বলা খুব জরুরি এবং আমি 2 মিনিট সেই কতগুলি বিষয়ের ওপর আলোকপাত করে মূল অনুষ্ঠানের দিকে যাব। সম্প্রীতি মিউনিক এই সংগঠনটি সৃষ্টি হয়েছিল 2014 সালে। 9 করে 7 বছরে আমরা পড়েছি। এই 7 বছরে জার্মানির সমস্ত প্রান্ত থেকে আমাদের নানাবিধ কার্যক্রম এবং অনুষ্ঠানাদি চলতে থাকে এবং তাদের সমস্ত কিছুর পেছনে আমরা যাদের অনুপ্রেরণা এবং পৃষ্ঠপোষকতা পেয়েছি তারা হচ্ছেন 2 জন, এবং তাদেরই উদ্যোগে আজকে আমরা নেতাজির এই 125 বছরের অনুষ্ঠানের উদ্যোগ নিয়েছি বলাই বাহুল্য। এবং আশা করি আপনারা সবাই জানেন সেই 2 জন পৃষ্ঠপোষক, একজন ডক্টর অনিতা পাফ আর একজন ডক্টর মার্টিন পাফ। তাই অনুষ্ঠানের পরের ভাগে আমাকে হয়তো ইংরেজিতে সুইচ করে যেতে হবে আলোচনা চালানোর জন্য, বাট এটা বলা জরুরি যে ওনাদের উদ্যোগেই আজকে সারা পৃথিবীর তথা দেশের এবং বিদেশের অনেক বাঙালি এই অনুষ্ঠান দেখছেন এবং দেখবেন। সম্প্রীতির সদস্যরা সর্বতভাবে এই অনুষ্ঠানে আছেন এবং নানাভাবে এই অনুষ্ঠানকে সার্থক করার পেছনে অক্লান্ত পরিশ্রম করছেন এবং আমাদের সংগঠনের তরফ থেকে এই উদ্যোগ যাতে আরো বেশি করে বাঙালি যোগদান করেন এবং নেতাজির 125 বছরের ইতিহাসকে যাতে আমরা নতুন করে আরো আলোকপাত করতে পারি, তার জন্য শুধু একবার নয়, প্রতি মাসে আমরা চেষ্টা করছি এই অনুষ্ঠান করার। এবং আপনারা যারা আজকে যোগদান করছেন এবং করেছেন এবং আগামী মাসেও এবং তারপরের মাসগুলোতেও করবেন 125 বর্ষপূর্তি অবধি, যাতে এই অনুষ্ঠানটি আরো ভালোভাবে অনুষ্ঠিত হতে পারে। So without much further ado, I just give a bit of a summary about the background for our non-Bengali speaking audience who has joined this. This event is being conducted simultaneously on Zoom for Sampriti members and some special guests, whereas the larger population is able to witness this live right now on our Facebook channel. It is important perhaps to mention a few words. Why are we doing this? It has 2 aspects. As an organization, it is Sampriti's privilege to be part of this historic milestone of Netaji's 125th anniversary next year in 2 aspects. Aspect number 1, we are based in Munich, Germany, which has been at one point in time the Karma Bhumi of Netaji. Germany holds a special place in his life, both personally and professionally. From the first declaration over Radio Berlin after the great journey from India to the performance of the national anthem in Hamburg, Netaji has incubated the first free India from this foreign soil since the 1940s. Therefore, as a premier Bengali organization in Germany, Sampriti is endeavoring in preserving Netaji's legacy in Germany and the greater Europe with such humble efforts. On the personal front, it was here that Netaji married Emily Schenkel, which is sustained as 3 generations of Bose bloodline today. Here too, it is Sampriti's special privilege to have Dr. Anita Pfaff, the daughter of Emily and Subhas, along with her husband, Dr. Martin Pfaff, as their honorable patrons. We are therefore kickstarting this year-long celebration of Netaji 125 through a series of conversations on Netaji's life, legacy, mission, and vision. The Anita Dialogues will select a milestone on each month to anchor a dialogue. Occasionally, we will feature a guest personality or a relative, a keen, or even a Netaji researcher to bring more perspectives into the discussions. And what can be a better date than to start today in the month of February, where there are so many big milestones in Netaji's life. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my special privilege to welcome you to this opening session of the Anita Dialogues and introduce to you Dr. Anita Pfaff for the global audience.
Namaskar.
Good afternoon. The whole world is watching you. Today, I am expecting a huge crowd, not only of my own extended family of the Sampriti members who has joined in this Zoom conference. There are also some special guests. And not the least, I can already see a huge amount of momentum that is happening as we are watching this live on the Sampriti Facebook channel. So I must take excuse from the audience that you will see me flipping screens and fiddling with a lot of devices. That is not because I am ignoring the conversations, but because I have to keep a watch on many of your questions that is coming from multiple channels in this digital world. So this is not my day today. I am just the anchor, and I have to ensure that I anchor this conversation in the way that it is relevant in today's context, number one, and number two, the right kind of questions which many of you have always had the intent to answer. I think you have Dr. Anita Pfaff with you to answer and to throw more light. So I have already spoken enough. We are already 12 minutes past 3. We will try to keep this conversation as lively and centered around you as possible. So I will just make a very provocative question to begin with. How was your last 23rd January? We saw you all over the internet.
Namaskar again to all of you, to the members of Sampriti and also the other guests who are participating. Welcome to you. And to get to your question, well, last 23rd January was a bit confusing because I was in various Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp interviews, and somehow technically it didn't always work out as well as this seems to be working out. So I I was fairly tired
I
at the end of the day.
I think you were the eye of the press on 23rd, because a surprise of surprises, I saw you even on Hindi channels, and hardcore Hindi channel anchors in India switching to English just to interview you.
Unfortunately, since my Hindi and Bengali is far too little to carry on a conversation or even follow a conversation well, it had to be in English.
Okay, so what we have done is we have chosen to split this conversation on two aspects of Netaji's life's milestone, and we also will try to deliberate and go to the depth of it. The audience is curious to know more insights that they do not get in the public discourse, which might be available with you, which you can help discover them better. And of course, we have the chat window open both for the Zoom participants as well as the Facebook Live participants. Please feel free to put in your questions on the chat window, and we will try to also take the relevant ones for today's topic and put it forward for addressing.
Yeah, let me maybe add one more thing. Shaibal very kindly sort of implied that you're sort of, you'll be getting an insider information, so to say. I just want to say a word of warning. One tends to believe that friends or family sort of automatically know more about the lives of their dear ones. But of course, since I have never really met my father personally and have never talked to him as an adult, I was 4 weeks old and the conversation probably was somewhat limited at the time. So my knowledge about my father is also from what others told me or from what I've read. So maybe Shaibal and myself, though we are interested in the person, we love him, admire him, we are not sort of persons with the greatest insight. There may be some scholars who know more about the topic, or you might say that our view might be sort of our personal private view and not so much a general truth. So please expect the personal side, but not so much a lecture on history.
Absolutely. And I think that is where my first question is also pointed. On 23rd of January, you know, these are the dates where you get to receive a lot of WhatsApp forwards. And 23rd of January was also no exception. And I received a very interesting WhatsApp forward. I received a PDF file. And someone has taken a lot of pains to list down all the books that was written on Netaji. And I was so fascinated. Most of the WhatsApp forwards you tend to ignore, but it was one of those WhatsApp forwards which I not only preserved, I took a printout, which is a 12-pager list of books that has been written on Netaji in all languages. My question to you is, if you ever write a book on your father, will it start on 8th of February?
If I ever write a book on my father, I have to answer, first of all, I will not write a book about my father because I neither have the sort of personal memories to write a book which might be source material for others, nor am I a historian to sort of provide a better insight from a scholar's point of view. What I'm planning to do is to write a book about my mother, and in fact, my two co-authoresses are present in this meeting. This is my niece Madhuri in London and my daughter Maya in Cape Town, South Africa, and we feel that we can contribute something to the history of Netaji as well, but also to my mother's history, because she herself was an interesting person and an interesting woman. So we also sort of want to give the feminine touch or feminist touch to this story.
But I have always thought that 8th February is perhaps the starting of one of the most thrilling and fascinating aspects in Netaji's life. And you are privy to some very interesting anecdotes of that episode.
Well, February 8th was certainly the beginning of probably what was the most adventurous and dangerous part of his life, because at least that's what I've heard from others who have talked to him after the end of this voyage. He felt that parts of this voyage were certainly hazardous and probably also difficult. We have to look at it from that point of view. Netaji set out on a submarine voyage on the 8th of February 1943. And even today, I think submarines are not the sort of most cozy and comfortable places to be, but they are certainly, as far as I've learned, bigger than the submarines built during the Second World War. And first of all, the space situation was unpleasant for laymen. But the other part was that this was a wartime journey, and the submarine had to pass through sort of enemy territory to reach its destiny. And that too was a very dangerous and hazardous thing. And then being cooped up in a tight space, part underwater, part over water, and risking aerial attacks and imminent danger from torpedoes must have been a very trying situation.
How did you know all this?
Well, of course, the stories of the submarine journey were sort of reported by different people in different books, and the most direct report of the submarine journey I got from a gentleman who was chief machinist on the submarine. I happened to get to know him long after the end of World War II, when I moved to my present home near Munich, Germany, where he lived in Augsburg. And he came to know about me and got in touch. And after that, we've met several times until his death many years ago. This was Mr. Herrman Wien, and he also wrote a short report, which is available on internet as well for those who might be interested and who read German. And of course, he has also talked about his journey during our meetings.
Sorry, I have had the chance to get hold of a few pictures of the submarine, and if you can help us help the audience understand the place and the pictures, perhaps, because I wanted to show this to the audience as well, so that we are, I am, here you go. So these are the pictures of the U-boat, which is currently a naval museum in Labo. And if I'm not wrong, this is precisely the place in North Germany from where Netaji started his submarine journey.
The submarine, which eventually he traveled on, started in Kiel, and the crew was not told where they were going and what they were doing, or eventually they were told the incorrect story that they were to take two machinists or machine engineers to northern Scandinavia, and on the eve of the departures, some suitcases were brought to the submarine, and then the submarine set out, and two passengers, my father and his aide-de-camp, Abid Hassan Safrani, were brought onto the submarine when they had left Kiel already, to keep this very secret. That was the utmost concern, that the British might learn that Subhash Chandra Bose was on a submarine on his way to the Far East, and that might have endangered him even more than the journey itself already did anyway. And then the submarine set out traveling around the northern part of Great Britain, and ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. And this was, of course, territory which was exceedingly dangerous because it was under control of the British, and there was a very active submarine war ongoing. And in fact, the submarine theater of war was so dangerous that about 3/4 of all the submarine crews were killed during World War II. I don't know whether the same number holds for the British and or the Allied submarines, but definitely for the German ones. And in fact, U-180, which was the submarine my father traveled on, was not the only one which eventually was sunk, but after the return from the journey with my father. And on the way with the submarine, they also had some so-called enemy encounters. And in fact, U-180 sunk a British submarine somewhere in the Indian Ocean after they had drowned the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and liaisoned with a Japanese submarine near Madagascar, where my father and Abid Hassan were transferred to the Japanese submarine. Two Japanese engineers were transferred to the German submarine. And luckily for the German submarine, the Japanese had also transferred some gold bars in payment for armament. And these gold bars possibly saved the life of the submarine crew when they returned to Europe, specifically to Bordeaux in France. And at least Mr. Wien thought that the submarine received air defense and support. And he said, normally a submarine wouldn't have gotten that, but probably our precious load had to be protected. And so they survived this dangerous journey.
So when was your last, so is it a coincidence? So it is a coincidence that you stay in the outskirts of Augsburg, and the gentleman who accompanied your father as a machinist in the submarine in that 77-day voyage across the Atlantic, North and the South Atlantic. He also eventually was in your neighborhood if he was staying in Oxford, correct?
That was a mere coincidence.
Okay.
Because first of all, there were very few of the submariners who survived the Second World War. And by the time my husband and I moved to Germany, that was in 1971, some of them also had died after the end of the Second World War. And these submariners met once a year. And I think of the whole crew of around 60, only 15 were still alive at that time, and a good part of them, also the chief engineer of the crew, met in Augsburg once, and they invited us to for a dinner get-together, and we got to know some of the other submariners who were still alive. My mother was also present at that time.
Okay, I think this is going to be a very fascinating story if really followed up by history buffs and Netaji researchers, because personally, even if it is in a German, I think the audience will take, some of the audience will definitely take interest in trying the details, trying to find out the details of what Mr. Herrman Wien wrote about. So what I will try to do is provide a link of that article that the machinist Mr. Herrman Wien wrote, and have it published as well, so that more and more people can get access to that very detailed account of the voyage and how they saw Netaji cope up with that very, very arduous journey. I think that was one part of our discussion, and as a part of this initiative, what we are also trying to do is finding out and uncovering such lesser known aspects of Netaji's life. And just like we are picking up these kind of milestone dates for our monthly discussions, I would also like people back in India or Indians spread across the globe find out more about Netaji here in Germany. Because if your encounter with someone like Mr. Herrman Wien is quite recent, I think there are many such locations in Germany as well, which bear a lot of connection to Netaji that should be, if not preserved, but definitely be known to all of us. So in this course of these interactions that we have started to have today, I will select a digital marker of a place that connects Netaji in Germany or in larger Europe every month. And with your permission, I am deciding to choose Labo in the north of Germany to be our first digital marker on Netaji's 125. I don't know whether we will get government support for this, but definitely we can make a petition because we know that the ancestral house of Netaji in Cuttack, for example, is preserved. Why not attempt to do something around Netaji's touch points abroad as well? So with every session, we will try to pick up one such place. And of course, I am sure you would know more than many of us of those memorable places that your mother might have told you about, or from other sources. So for this session and for this topic, I would like to declare Labo as the first digital marker connected to Netaji's 125. Okay. For the audience, I would request that if you wish to ask questions on this topic, please feel free. We have a few people in the background who are collating the questions. I still have to get hold of those. Till the time I get those questions and pass it on for some further discussion, I would like to move to the next topic, which again is a milestone in Netaji's life. And in February, because we are in February, we are discussing some of the milestones in Netaji's life. So 8th of February, if it was the start of the submarine journey, we will move or shift our gears in February to another milestone, which is perhaps not as thrilling and adventurous, but nevertheless relevant in today's context or in the historical context, is 19th to 21st of February, where Netaji assumed the presidentship of the Indian National Congress in Haripura. We all know the historical circumstances around that, but I do believe that in a forum like this, we have the possibility to know it better, and even from your side as to what are your thoughts around Haripura Congress.
Haripura Congress, of course, was an important milestone in my father's political life, because being the president of Congress was certainly a very prominent position. We have to sort of try to keep in mind who, in general, were the sort of the most important personalities in the leadership of the Indian independence movement of the time. And of course, the preeminent person was Mahatma Gandhi. And in essence, he, at that stage, could very much sort of decide what was to be. And it was with his support that Netaji had been elected Congress president at the time. Netaji at that time was a young leader, we have to keep in mind. This was 1938 when the Haripura Congress took place. And Netaji had been born in 1897. So that makes him about 41 years. Well, maybe not quite young, but sort of early middle age. And compared, say, to persons like Mahatma Gandhi and the leaders of his generation, also compared to Deshbandhu C.R. Das, who had unfortunately long since then passed away. My father was a young leader, and what I would like to point out for those who sort of may not be that familiar with his political or the spectrum of his political life, he was a leftist leader. Very often Netaji is put into relation more to the right wing, for the simple reason that, first of all, he was a nationalist, but all the freedom fighters, of course, were nationalists at the time, and that he later sought the support of Britain's enemies to gain India's independence. And Britain's enemies at that time were the fascist right-wing regimes of Germany, Italy, and Japan, to name the three most prominent ones. And they certainly were considered fascist and right-wing. But Netaji, in his whole outlook, also in his vision of what he wanted to see for India, was a socialist, was a left-wing person, really. Similarly, by the way, as Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was. These two were the sort of young leaders of the left at the time. And the vision that that Netaji had about India after independence, at least with a sort of thick brush, was painted in his Haripura Presidential Congress Congress address. And some of the issues that he touched upon certainly have remained pressing issues. First of all, it was fighting poverty, it was fighting illiteracy, and incidentally, maybe, or let's put it that way, I'm not sure that it was that much on the mind of people at the time when he gave that speech. In any case, he sort of foresaw that there would be a demographic development, that is growth of population, which in itself would also create difficulties for India as a country, for the simple reason that even in economic growth, if your population grows very fast, it is very difficult to make individual people better off if you sort of have to at the same time tend with a growing and very young population. Because if you look at it that way, for quite a number of years, if the children are to grow into adults who can contribute something productive to their country and to their families, also involves learning something. It involves a period of time when they are sort of dependent on the support of others, specifically their parents. And even though we have this very sad experience in many countries, also like India, that the countries cannot afford to sort of support and educate all their young people. And you find, even today, you find child labor in India, instead of finding these children going to school and find child schooling for them, which of course would be very necessary. So I think this was a problem which did come up and which he foresaw at the time. And another thing which, of course, for me was also particularly interesting is that he was one of the persons who also was very interested, and I think more so interested than many others, in women's emancipation. He foresaw that women should hold a stronger position in society than they did and partly do today. And of course, for him, equal rights also meant equal duties. So for example, he felt that women had to be engaged in the struggle for independence, be it without or with weapons, even just as much as men had to be. And unfortunately, one of the developments in India, which today is not very satisfactory, is that the position of women, even though you find some with outstanding roles, like former prime ministers and other prominent roles, but the, let's say, normal Indian woman, even though they may, some of them may be quite well educated, are not really that involved in society, and they also do not have a stronger position. I always find it very sad that India has the reputation not only of being the biggest or most populous democracy in the world, but it's also the country with the highest rate of crime against women. And this is certainly something which Netaji would not have approved of very much. And on the contrary, I think he would have done everything to combat this situation.
Yeah, and I think especially for the Haripura Congress, he took up the presidency right after a regime of Jawaharlal Nehru. Yeah, and I have read that there were 200,000 people attending the Haripura Congress to celebrate his his taking up of the presidency, and there was a 2-mile bullock cart procession on that. And today, as you know, the election wars in Bengal and some other states in India have started, and we are talking about who beats the other in procession. But that time, a procession as big as that was really a reflection of the leader's popularity. So what, in your opinion, was the charisma of Netaji which earned him so much of popularity, apart from his ideology and all the points that you mentioned, of course?
I imagine it was, there were many different aspects to it. Of course, from what I've heard from others, and not only from my mother, but also from people who had never met Netaji personally, but even seen him at a distance only, they said that he had a tremendous personal magnetism and aura. I heard people say, well, I've only seen him from a distance, but he made a great difference in my life and changed my life. I think it was probably his own dedication and possibly also his own spirituality, which enabled him to convey something to others, which, well, in more modern language, I would say empowered them to some extent, led them to sort of realize their own potential, and at the same time also sort of inspired them to sacrifice themselves. Since he was a person who's practically sacrificed everything in his life, including his life for India's independence, I think he was also quite
leading by example, you mean to say? Yeah?
I think he was sort of a very single-minded in this issue, and I've heard that he had sort of complained to his brother or to Deshbandhu Siya Das that others were not as dedicated, not as willing to sort of give everything and give all their time and effort to India's independence. And very often others had to say, well, it's easy for you to say you don't have a family to care for. For example, Deshbandhu and Vasant Devi, his wife, had a family, had children who also needed care apart from the struggle for independence. And of course, his brother Sharad had 8 children to care for, who also had to be taken care of quite apart from his dedication and his willingness to risk to go to jail and all that. And so in that sense, my father was rather unencumbered by these burdens. On the other hand, I'm quite.
And you was the youngest. You was the youngest of all the sons. So you.
No, he was the 3rd youngest. He was the 6th of 8 sons.
6 of the sons. Youngest son.
Had 2 younger brothers. One died relatively young, and the 2nd youngest lived very long. He lived in Bombay, and of course he's dead and gone too. But my father was the 9th child in his family and the 6th son in the family. So it was a large family, and my grandmother, from what I've heard, must have been sort of like the manager of a middle-sized business, running a household of her 14 children, then partly grandchildren, partly she took care of her own younger siblings. He, in a way, he was supported by this family. He was sheltered by this family. But on the other hand, he did not have to take care of a family himself, because, for example, when I was born, he was sort of on his way, more or less on his way to the submarine, and he never felt that he had to be encumbered by taking care of either my mother or me, but realized that my mother would have to fend for the two of us. And so I think this dedication also sort of inspired others to enter the struggle for independence, possibly with more courage and more willingness to sacrifice things than what we modern beings are accustomed to nowadays.
Yeah. So just to come back to that Haripura topic, because Haripura was a milestone in a way that it was at that time the difference in the approaches to the freedom struggle was coming to the surface. Netaji's more radical line and Gandhiji's line of non-violence, for that matter, which we all know also culminated in the next Congress in Tripoli, which we will of course discuss in the topic of later discussion. But my question is, in a macro perspective, if I see it from a macro history perspective, mid-30s is the time that we know Netaji started to visit Europe, Vienna for eye surgery and some other purposes. It was during that time, we also know in 1933, Hitler's ascendancy to the chancellorship, and 1937 Congress winning the elections, and then comes Haripura Congress, where Netaji kind of is of the opinion, and he writes as the president of the Congress after Haripura, that his intention is to give the British an ultimatum of 6 months before a revolt comes up. So it's kind of a more radical way of taking independence away from the British. So what do you think is perhaps the historical context has in terms of influencing his more stronger line? Do you think the international developments at that point in time had a bearing on this, as historians write? Do you tend to agree to that?
It's very difficult to sort of put oneself into the shoes of the people of that period, because I think, after all, the India's struggle for independence, I think, had an important role not only for India but also for other colonial countries, because I think India's success in gaining independence also lay a basis to some extent for many of the other ex-colonies of European countries to struggle for independence and eventually gain independence. Possibly there were some sort of the geopolitical trends which had an impact. First of all, there was a certain tendency towards radicalism, strengthening of authoritarian regimes. I mean, we have to think of the Soviet Union, which had become a power to speak of, even though the country had remained poor as far as the civilian sector was concerned. It was a power to reckon with. Of course, the European colonial powers played an important role, and less so on the authoritarian radical side, but partly also as a consequence of the way World War I was ended. The Nazi regime and Italian fascist regime was sort of strengthened in coming about And we should not forget that the economic crisis of the early 1930s also contributed to the fact that, at least in Germany, that a radical regime could come into power because somehow this regime also instituted an economic policy which later on we would have called Keynesian, which partly helped in economic terms, but at the same time laid the foundation of World War II and all sorts of negative developments at the same time. If you look at the other end of the world, Japan had become an important power in that region, and there again you had an authoritarian regime which as far as the political and economic position became a powerful geopolitical player of those days. And I think these developments certainly may have had an important impact on my father's thinking in terms of trying to gain support of sources outside of India for the independence struggle. I mean, he wasn't the only one. There were others who had gone to Japan before. There were others who had gone to Europe before, but I think he certainly was possibly more internationally oriented than many of the other Indian leaders.
Correct. We all know how Mohan Singh set up the INA with the Japanese and when your father took over. So there were people who were waiting for this opportunity to come. We are close to the 1 hour mark. Not that we have a very strong time pressure here, but I think that conversation, of course, achieves a lot if it is restricted to the right size and time. And therefore, I was looking around, as you could see me fiddling around, because I was looking around for a few questions. There are many questions that has come up. But unfortunately, I must say that what I'm trying to do is to respect the topics connected to the milestones of his life. We are trying to take up questions which are relevant either to the voyage, which started from 8th of February, and the Haripura Congress, the political repercussions around Haripura Congress to pick up in these conversations. We have many other questions, not that they are not relevant, but definitely we will pick it up in the correct month where that topic will be discussed. So what I will do is I will pick up a question which is directly related to the political ideology of Netaji. And this question has come from, by the way, I can see there is a lot of participation from all across the globe, by not only from the US or the rest of Europe, but also back home in India. And this question is very interesting because I know Mr. Sumeru Raichaudhuri, avid researcher of your father, and he is a relentless crusader about a lot of topics connected with your father, and he has a very political question related to his ideologies. So he is writing here, no doubt Netaji was a leftist and not that of Fabian and Gandhian type. What he asks is, how far was he from Marxian ideology on economic and social issues? What's your viewpoint on that?
Well, maybe we should have asked him to answer that question, because he's being a researcher. He may even be more knowledgeable about that issue. I can answer this sort of being a social democrat myself. I don't think he was a Marxist, because if he had been, he might have joined the communist movement at the time. and not the Congress movement. But I imagine that one aspect which might have also entered into his decisions at the time was that possibly he was also aware that the communist and Marxist movements in different countries were not only strongly supported, but also strongly influenced and controlled by the Soviet regime. And we have to keep in mind, Soviet regime at that time was a Stalinist regime, which in terms of its humanitarian orientation was no better than the German or the Japanese fascist regime. And we have to keep in mind that Netaji, in a very positive sense, was an Indian nationalist. He was interested in India's independent role, and he certainly would not have been very keen on changing from one colonial power, Britain, to a pseudo-colonial power, Soviet Union at the time. And with a Marxist leaning, that may have been more difficult. The other thing, I think some of the ideas that he espoused at the time, you might consider more what we would now call social democratic rather than socialist, in the sense that some of the economic implications in the socialist and the social democratic systems are different, and so I mean, this is it's not a black and white or left and right kind of category. I mean, you have a sort of wide range of in practical economic and political systems, of a mix of systems which are predominantly one or predominantly the other, but actually are a mix of what in economic terms you might call market related and socialist or communist at the other end. And in fact, you have some countries which for many years, for example, had nationalized certain sectors of the economy, which you would call a Marxist element or a socialist element in their politics and their economy. So I think he certainly had in mind a strong state for India. So that had of course elements of the socialist, and if you would want to say so, also of the nationalist, say, elements from Japan or Germany. But
I think this topic requires a tea time conversation on a longish nature, because there are a lot of related subjects that also come to my mind. For example, that how can, in today's context, how could he form a leftist organization like Forward Bloc while being within the Congress? It's unimaginable in today's context, because we are born in an era where we have always seen the International Congress and the leftists at loggerheads, in political loggerheads, physical loggerheads, societal loggerheads. But during those times, the circumstances was such that both C.R. Das in 1920s, Netaji himself in 1939 or 1940 after he formed, both of them, they created this leftist organizations by being within the party, for example. So I would say that, of course, the answer to this question is difficult, I recognize, and it requires a much broader canvas to paint. But nevertheless, that is the kind of audience we have, who are very, very interested, not just in specific factual aspects of your father's life, but also with the intent to understand, decipher his ideology more and more in order to discover him. And that is why this 12 pages of books, we'll have one more book perhaps on that. I'm conscious about the time. We are past the 1 hour mark, and I, of course, can try and see if there are any more questions here that will be of. Okay, yeah, here comes an interesting question. I was expecting this question, of course, yeah. But I leave it to you whether you would like to take this up. It is. I don't know who has sent it. Okay, it has come from another enthusiast, young guy, Sambuddha. You have met him in one of our forums. So he says, what are your views on the Munich Agreement of 1938 that the then British Prime Minister Chamberlain signed with Hitler, one that was so different from the policies of his successor, Churchill? What do you think Netaji might have viewed that in the context of forming an alliance back then in Europe against the British rule? So fundamentally, he's saying about the subjugation of Chamberlain in Munich, or the annexation of Czechoslovakia, and the radical opposite nature that Churchill was, who succeeded Chamberlain. So what do you think Netaji might have viewed this incident when he's talking about the Munich Accord?
Well, that's very difficult. Of course,
yes. I know.
Let me look at it more from today's point of view, where we have to deal in a similar vein with different regimes, which we may feel very ambivalent or negative about. And the question remains, that also was important at that time: to what extent can you go and pamper systems like that? Or to what extent would it be necessary to oppose them? And of course, ex post facto, we can say, well, it didn't make any sense to try to pamper the German system, because they did what they did anyway. I mean, after Hitler-Stalin pact, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and Germany didn't bother and attack Poland, pretending that it was the Poles who attacked them and things like that. Ex post facto, one might say, if you can sort of contain possibly dangerous and negative power and keep them from doing less harm than they might otherwise, there may be a justification, because the other alternative to go to war with the system is, as we know, a very expensive one in terms of human lives, but also in terms of what economic well-being we destroy really during a war, or what loss of life we have in a different sense. If you look at the life expectancy of people in a war zone as compared to a zone where you have had peace for many years. So I guess one might have envisaged that it's not worthwhile to try to sort of pamper the German system, but I would not dare to try to imagine what the viewpoint of a person at that point in time was, because we can always be smart later on looking back.
Yeah, but on a historical timeline, I have a point to make. The Munich Accord was signed on 30th of September 1938. And if you notice this date on the timeline, it is just in the middle of Haripura Congress earlier in February that year, and the Tripuri Congress in March the following year. So it is exactly at the center point. Who knows, the posturing that Netaji picked up for Tripuri Congress, the more aggressive posture, might be inspired by many of these incidents like Munich Accord, which perhaps made him to more and more believe that giving an ultimatum to the British is the better way, because Hitler might win the war, or it looks the historical unfolding. I'm just saying that this incident happened right in the middle of the two important Congress sessions of his life. So we don't know how it impacted him, but definitely it had a bearing in some way, though it is too difficult to find what his opinion or viewpoint was on this. I agree. I understand. Okay, so I think that was our two topics for February. Thank you so much for helping us launch this conversations. We will pick up similar interesting and discussion over the conversation topics in the month of March and going forward every month. For the audience, our humble submission is we will try to ensure that these conversations are happen in a regular, predictive way. On Sundays, around the middle of the month, we will pick up these dates appropriately and communicate to all of you well in advance, so that you can join. You can also do your own research, because I could see the questions today was more around the opinion that you were seeking rather than anything else, which is perhaps also a way to stimulate public discourse. We should welcome that approach as well. And we will announce every month's date of the Anita Dialogues at the beginning of the month on the Facebook page of Sampriti. Please continue to be with us on this initiative. We have also opened up a dedicated email ID for you, netaji125@sampritimunich.org. Please shoot in your opinions, feedback, specific topics that you want us to discuss in a specific month. Only be aware of the fact that we want to pick up the milestones of that relevant month. So if we have discussed the submarine topic in February and Haripura Congress, is because it happened on 8th of February and 19th to 21st of February. Similarly, we are open to your suggestions. Please send us your emails, your feedback, your thoughts and ideas on this topic. And as always, you will get the latest updates on Sampriti's Facebook page, where we have gone live today. We will update you with posts. And last but not the least, I would, of course, like to thank Dr. Anita Pfaff for agreeing to this initiative, coming over here, launching the topic, and promising to be there in this journey as we together reach that 125th anniversary, discussing the life and legacy. I've always been fascinated by her thoughts about her father, and also the fact that she wishes that the countrymen remember him for his life, his ideology, his mission, vision, his legacy, than the other topics. So thank you for being with us, and we continue to seek your patronage in the coming months as well. Thanks to the Sampriti members and the executive committee who have supported this initiative and given me the momentum to carry forward. I especially want to thank the events team and the executive committee of Sampriti, who has been the backbone of this activity. And last but not the least, all the global audience who were there today and joining this and making it a very, very interactive session. We look forward to your continued support in more numbers, and of course, as always, open to your feedback and suggestions. So with that, it is curtains for the first session of the Anita Dialogues, and the date for March will be announced in the next couple of weeks. Please stay tuned to our Facebook page at Sampriti Munich. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and have a nice weekend, whatever is left. See you next time.